Greetings, class 702. Here we are once again doing the video lecture series for the theories for our class. This week we're going to be focusing on the postmodern theories, some kind of things that have come to light within the last 20, 30 years really. And that really splinters into two groups, at least for the purpose of this video lecture and for this course. We're going to be talking about narrative therapy. We're also going to be talking about solution-focused brief therapy. Okay, both fall under the headline of postmodern theories. Just for reference sake, solution-focused therapy was originally brought about by Insoo Kim Berge and Steve DeShazier in the late 1970s. And it's Michael White and David Epstein for the narrative therapy, also in the 70s and 80s. What do we mean when we talk about postmodern therapies? Usually postmodern is oftentimes referred to anything that kind of has a given that truth is coming from a point of view, that it is a matter of perspective, things are subjective via the viewer, and it's really kind of up to each of us as individuals to kind of understand our own worlds. What a postmodern therapist does is we focus on our client's reality, and sometimes that may involve disregarding the facts. We might try to ignore certain things that may or may not be relevant, these facts, because we're giving the primary importance on the story itself, how things are perceived through the eyes of the client. So we're not oftentimes kind of calling them out and kind of putting them on the spot. We're concerned with their reality. Language creates stories. That can be said with any form of communication. But it's interesting to kind of focus sometimes on the language itself, the actual wording that's been used, to kind of give us a better idea of the story. It can touch upon cultures, it can touch upon time periods. The actual words that we're saying can help us have a better understanding of our client's subjective reality. If I were to play an audio tape, which obviously doesn't exist, from the Freud era, when people first started therapy and things along those lines, obviously we'd be able to tell a story based on the language that they're using that would be very different from the stories that are told today based on the language that modern day people use with the vernacular. So again, language is kind of time-pieced, and it does kind of paint a picture for us. We have, as postmodern therapists, we have a critical stance of knowledge, things that we usually take for granted. We are being critical of the facts. We're not so much concerned about facts. Again, we're concerned about the story. We understand that knowledge is time and cultural bound. We understand that everything that we're talking about, even the words that I'm using right now, I've learned. And I've learned because of the environment that surrounds me, and I've learned because of the acculturation that I've had throughout my life. And also, obviously, because of the time period. It's now 2011, and certainly that has something to do with me and how I perceive the world, and we keep these things in mind. And all of these things are learned through a social process. We absorb these things, most likely in the beginning from our parents, our school teachers, our friends and family, and everything along the way, from TV commercials to overhearing something on the bus on the way to work. So this whole process of socialization is where we get our language from, and we're aware of this whole process when we think about going forward with people's stories and things of that sort. The first thing I'm going to focus on is narrative therapy, since we're talking about stories and storytelling. Once again, pioneered by Michael White and David Epstein. Narrative therapy. In narrative therapy, individuals construct meaning of life through stories, which they treat as truth. Right now, if I were to ask you to tell me your life story, you guys would kind of tell me a story, and we would accept that to be true. That we would accept that to be the reality, as if we were looking it up kind of in a fact book. And people live their lives according to this truth, based on the stories that they've told to themselves, and how they live that truth is either authentic or it's kind of misconceived, based on the story and how they told it and how they retell it and retell it and retell it over and over and over in their minds. The dominant culture has narratives which oftentimes work against the individual. There are bigger storylines sometimes than our own stories. Obviously something like 9/11, for example, would kind of weigh heavy over some personalized stories at times. So sometimes the dominant culture, what's happening outside of your individual self, also has some sort of say in the story of your life. I'm sure we can all think of events, either political or cultural or whatever it is that had a major important part in our life that was kind of given to us or thrown at us without necessarily us seeking it out. That's the dominant culture. We do realize that we are a part of a larger system. And when we start talking about narrative therapy, oftentimes we realize that clients are often stuck in problem-saturated stories, and they really don't work for them. The story that they are telling is not the story of the person that they want to be. And we try to kind of expose that, and we try to kind of highlight that, and we try to create a new story. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that. So when we focus on narrative therapy, we are focusing on the client's stories. We are oftentimes focusing on the positives. As the story unfolds and as people begin to communicate, we will take note and we will point out all of the positive qualities that will then help our individuals or help our clients kind of move forward and use those positives as fuel, as ways of recognizing success. And we'll come back to why that's important in a little bit. We are facilitating exploration. We are asking people to kind of go to certain places in their mind that maybe perhaps other people haven't asked them to go to. We want them to kind of explore their inner thoughts and maybe try to tell some stories that they haven't told in a long time or maybe never at all. So we're kind of facilitating that process. And we are separating stories from dominant stories to be successful. Sometimes we might tell a story that is an isolated event, and it may not totally encompass who we are as individuals. And we're trying to get people to kind of separate these facts, that, hey, you can tell a sad story, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a sad person, for example. So what are the role of the stories? As we know, they shape our reality, and we grow out of telling them. Oftentimes, you might think of a typical scenario, you're talking to an old grandfather who's telling these old war tales, and how these stories really shape who they are and what people think of them, and how they think of themselves. It really helps develop character and personality, and each story adds to our being and how we're perceived in the world, especially when we tell it. And then even when you think, even on a grander scale, if we were to tell it to a microphone that's now recorded or before a live audience, it's very much a way of letting others know who you are or what you represent or what you stand for by the stories that you tell, and sometimes by the stories that you don't tell. As a therapist using narrative therapy, we need to listen with an open mind. We need to understand that there are no truths, there are no solid one-answer truths. We need to keep an open mind with that. That the client is right. Whatever they have to say, whatever they are expressing to us is their subjective reality, and that is the truth in this case. We are not passing judgments. We are not pushing blame. We are affirming and valuing these stories, whether they're positive or not. We are acknowledging that they exist, and that they have some sort of impact on the individual client that is telling us these things. And one of the things that we try to do in narrative therapy is we try to modify these stories. What that is we try to kind of change painful beliefs and values, again, without imposing our own values. But we're going to try to ask people to kind of tell their stories in a way that may kind of set them up to tell a different story, a new story, one that works for them better. Narrative therapy is a collaboration between the client and therapist. It's kind of a back and forth give and take, revolving around these stories. We need to look at these stories from a different perspective. Oftentimes we'll find exceptions within the stories. Someone might start with a story of saying like, well, I have always been a coward when it comes to approaching women and talking to them, for example. We might want to find exceptions in that story. Well, can you think of a time when you weren't a coward? Well, you were telling me about another story, and in that story you were talking about how you approached a woman, whatever. The point is that you're finding exceptions to the story. You are asking them to kind of observe things that maybe they aren't really focusing on based on what they've already told you. So to kind of get them to think about their truth in a different light.